It was a typical summer afternoon when the amusement park, the place where she spent most of her weekends, became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. Clara never imagined that the smile of a child getting on a roller coaster could be their last. But that day, something was off. Something in the air, something on the tracks. She didn't know it yet, but the park would never be the same again. The accident happened late in the afternoon, just before the park was about to close. The sky was painted with a deep orange hue, as if the sun itself was warning about the nightmare that was about to unfold. The sound of the roller coaster wheels on the tracks began to sound strange, but no one paid attention. The kids screamed with excitement as the cars plunged down at a dizzying speed. But halfway through the ride, a malfunction in the tracks sent the car spiraling out of control, derailing and sending the riders to certain death. Clara was nearby, watching from a distance. She remembers the sirens, people screaming and running, the smell of fear hanging in the air. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the roller coaster, now looking like a monstrous beast, swallowing lives and leaving only destruction in its wake. The authorities arrived quickly, but it was too late. There was nothing but wreckage, bodies, and screams that echoed in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The park was shut down immediately, and the roller coaster's name, once synonymous with fun, became a painful memory. Clara never looked at that place the same way again. The weight of those images stayed with her, like a distant echo of something she couldn't fully comprehend. The pain of the victims, the voices of the dead. Something inside her told her that the tragedy wasn't over yet. Something else was lurking, waiting to be uncovered. But it wasn't until a week later that the desire to understand what really happened began to consume Clara. The park was abandoned, closed for good, and the roller coaster, now shrouded in darkness, seemed to call to her. The mystery of how something so grotesque could have happened, with no explanation, started to eat away at her mind. Maybe she was the only one who could uncover the truth, the only one capable of looking beyond the terror everyone else feared. That night, Clara armed herself with a flashlight and an unshakable resolve. She wasn't going to let the roller coaster, or whatever had happened there, go unanswered. The park was closed now, but she knew the attraction was still there, waiting. The tracks, twisted and broken, seemed to mock her courage as she approached the entrance, guarded by a rusty fence and warning signs that almost seemed to be ignored by time. Clara felt a strange sensation as she crossed the line between the real world and the forbidden. Something in the air felt thick, heavy, as if the place was waiting for her. The sound of the wind through the trees and the creaking of old structures were the only noises around. But there was something else, a distant sigh, an invisible presence. She glanced behind her, a shiver running down her spine, but there was no one, just her and the park. The roller coaster looked different at night. Its rusted tracks seemed more menacing, as if watching Clara with a subtle malice. She walked toward the base of the structure, where the shadows of the old columns and towers of the ride took shape. The wind seemed to push her forward, and without meaning to, she started walking along the tracks. That's when, as she looked toward the boarding platform, Clara heard something, a muffled sound, almost imperceptible, but it made her heart race. It was a whisper, or was it laughter? Children's laughter? She quickly turned around, but saw no one, only the dark emptiness of the abandoned park. The vision started. They weren't real. She knew that, but they were like flashes, fleeting glimpses of moments before the accident. Children in the cars, smiling and shouting with joy. But soon the smiles turned into expressions of terror, bodies being thrown from the cart, the screams of panic, and the sound of something grotesquely breaking. Clara shut her eyes, trying to push the images away, but when she opened them, The laughter was louder, closer. She took a deep breath and tried to ignore it. But there was something there. Something beyond the memories of a tragic accident. Something watching her, waiting for her. She knew there was no turning back now. The biting night wind made Clara's hair fly in every direction, as if it had a life of its own. The flashlight in her hand shook, lighting only small areas around her, and the shadows of the park structure seemed to stretch grotesquely, as if watching her every move. The sound of distant laughter still echoed in her ears, but she knew she was alone. Or at least, that's what she wanted to believe. The park seemed like it had been abandoned for years, but Clara knew that wasn't quite true. It was just closed, waiting for the tragedy to fade from the collective memory. Yet, even with the darkness and silence, there was a strange feeling that the park had never truly stopped existing, as if it were just on pause, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing on the cracked asphalt streets and the fallen signs that marked where the attractions once were. The park entrance was behind her now, a distant sight. The rusty, crooked iron gates were locked, but Clara knew there was always a way in. She had easily slipped through the fence and was now inside the park, feeling like an intruder in a place that was clearly far from being a peaceful memory. The roller coaster stood ahead, a towering silhouette against the dark sky, its twisted metal structure looking even more threatening as Clara got closer. There were no blinking lights or cheerful sounds, like she used to hear during the fun days, just the heavy silence and the absence of life. She walked toward the base of the ride, feeling the cold air seep through her clothes. What had once been a source of joy for children now seemed like a dark beast, watching her with invisible eyes. Clara approached the first platform, where the cars used to board. The track was broken, and the metal pieces looked rusted and warped, as if time and where it had drained all the energy from the roller coaster. Suddenly, Clara's flashlight flickered. The light wavered, struggling to stay bright, and when it finally steadied, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, at the top of the ride, a shadow moved. Clara froze in place, her body stiff. The laughter she had heard earlier returned, sharper now, accompanied by voices calling her name. Was it an illusion, or was there something else? She looked toward the top of the roller coaster, where the iron towers rose, but saw no one. The shadow, if it had even been a shadow, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the growing fear taking hold of her. She wanted to turn and leave, but something inside her stopped her. She needed to find out what was going on here. Something was wrong, and she had to understand. With a sigh, she continued walking, her boots clicking on the crumbling asphalt and the wooden planks that made up the park's paths. With each step, the fear coiling in her chest seemed to grow stronger, but she couldn't turn back. Not now. Then, she heard the sound of a scream. Or was it an echo? The sound seemed to come from the roller coaster, but Clara couldn't pinpoint where. The sensation that someone was watching her surrounded her, as if the tracks, the structures, and even the wind had become witnesses to her presence. But there was no one, only her in the park, with its dark shadows and unsolved mysteries. She drew closer to the base of the structure, the sounds of laughter and screams now closer, clearer. But when she turned the corner, what she saw made no sense. There was no one, only the emptiness of the night. The flashlight illuminated the empty platform, and the air felt heavier, charged with a silent electricity, as if something was about to happen. Clara looked back. The park entrance was far behind her, and she knew she couldn't go back now. Something, maybe an invisible force, seemed to be pulling her toward the roller coaster. Each step felt harder, more oppressive, but at the same time, more necessary. She couldn't stop. She needed to know what had happened here, what was still happening. The sound of laughter returned, louder, more frantic. Clara couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. She drew closer to the ride structure, now feeling a sense of inevitability. The voices were calling her name, or at least it seemed like they were. She closed her eyes, trying to control her breathing. But when she opened them again, she saw something that made her stomach churn. At the top of the roller coaster, a silhouette appeared. A human figure, partially lit by the flashlight, was standing there. Clara couldn't make sense of what she saw, but something inside her knew. That figure wasn't human. Not anymore. Whatever was there, it was waiting. It was waiting for her. She took a step back, her body frozen in terror. But the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of laughter in the air. Now, she knew the park wasn't abandoned. The souls of those who had died were still there, trapped, waiting. And she had just walked into the nightmare. The silence in the park was deeper than before, as if the very earth had stopped breathing. Clara could feel the weight of the surroundings, as if the atmosphere had become thicker, heavier. The laughter had stopped, but the feeling of something watching her lingered, crawling beneath her skin. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, like the park itself was aware of her presence. She was close to the base of the roller coaster now, her feet heavy and her legs trembling with each step. The metal structure in front of her seemed even more sinister as the darkness took over the place. The lantern's light flickered, and the wind made the sound of the tracks creaking echo throughout the park. Clara wasn't sure if the sound was coming from somewhere far off or if it was just in her head. But she knew the voices, the laughter, weren't normal. The feeling of being watched intensified even more, and Clara quickly turned around. There, at the entrance to the roller coaster, she saw a figure. This time it was clearer, but still not entirely human. Its eyes, if it even had eyes, were like black, endless pits, deep and infinite. The skin, if it could even be called skin, was pale, almost translucent, and the hair fluttered as if the wind were moving it. But there was no wind. The creature didn't move, but Clara felt a pressure on her chest, as if the air were being sucked out of her lungs. She didn't know what to do, and the feeling that each breath was becoming more difficult with every second only grew. Fear suffocated her, and she was on the verge of panic. She wanted to run, scream, but her body was frozen. The creature or the soul, or whatever it was, stared at her with such intensity that Clara felt like she was being pulled into that black abyss, as if she were becoming a part of it. Then a voice, soft and whispering, was heard. It didn't come from anywhere physical, but it was in her mind, a presence seeping into her thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was like a distant echo, but so clear and powerful that it felt like it came from deep within the park itself. Clara felt the warmth of her body drain away as the voice continued to resonate in her mind, like a sad and melancholy song. "You will free us or replace us." The message was clear, but its meaning wasn't. The fear, the anguish, the sensation of being consumed by the darkness grew with each word. Clara began to understand what those souls wanted from her. They were trapped, condemned to an eternity of suffering on the roller coaster, waiting for something or someone to free them. But what Clara didn't understand was the price of that freedom. What would happen if she got more involved in this dark game? The roller coaster was more threatening than ever. Its tracks, once gleaming under the night lights, now appeared corroded by time, rusted and covered in black moss, as if they had been forgotten for an eternity. The metal structure loomed like a monster, skeletal and imposing, its tall peaks disappearing into the shadows, swallowed by the darkness. The sound of the rocks scraping against the tracks echoed like the groans of a living being in pain, reaching deep into Clara's soul, as if it were the final warning for her to turn back. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop now. Those voices, still echoing in her mind, began to intensify. It was as if each step she took in the park brought them back, every whisper tightening the anxiety in her chest. Clara felt the presences around her, almost tangible, moving between the shadows. She looked around but saw nothing. The figures were there, but their forms blended with the darkness, like specters that could only be felt, not seen. She was almost at the entrance to the first cart of the roller coaster, the lantern's light casting long shadows on the rusty metal walls. It felt as though she were being swallowed by an endless tunnel, with no way out. The tension in her chest grew, and fear consumed her mind, but she couldn't give up. The souls were still there waiting. That was when she heard a laugh. Light, soft, but full of malice. Clara spun around abruptly, but there was no one. The laughter, however, continued, like a distorted echo. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control her breath, trying not to give in to the panic that was building inside her. You came, finally. The voice seemed to be everywhere at once. Inside her head, all around her. Clara swallowed hard, fear paralyzing her again. When she looked ahead, she saw a figure slowly materializing in front of her. It was a child with large, empty eyes, its face pale as a moon. The child wore the clothes of a distant era, as though it had been trapped here for centuries. The expression on its face was a mixture of fear and resignation, as if it were waiting for something or someone. "They won't let me go," the child whispered, its voice full of sadness and desperation. "They keep me here, and they will keep you too." Clara took a step back, fear taking hold of her body. She looked around and saw more figures emerging, stepping out of the shadows, all with the same empty, pale eyes. Some whispered. Others just stared with vacant, lost looks, as if they weren't fully there, as if they were lost specters between the world of the living and the dead. "They want us for themselves," the child continued, taking a step toward Clara. "They won't let us go, never." The child's voice was a lament, a desperate plea, but there was something Clara couldn't understand. These weren't just lost souls. She felt there was something darker behind this cursed attraction. The child extended its hand, and Clara, unable to control her impulse, stepped forward. But in the next moment, something yanked her backward, strong as a gust of wind. She fell to the ground with force. When she looked up, the children were all there, standing, their forms distorted by the darkness, staring at her with vacant eyes. "You came to free us," one of the voices whispered, so low that Clara could barely hear it. "Or you'll replace them," another one added, with a soft, malicious laugh. Those words echoed in Clara's mind, growing increasingly unbearable. She tried to get up, but the fear was suffocating, as if the shadows around her were tightening around her chest, paralyzing her movements. She felt an overwhelming pressure, an invisible weight keeping her on the ground, and she knew she could no longer turn back. The souls were trapped here, waiting, and Clara no longer knew if she was helping or being used. When she looked ahead, she saw the roller coaster cart moving by itself, a loud and agonizing screech as it slowly approached the platform. The sound was like a promise. Something was about to happen. Then, as if an invisible curtain had been lifted, Clara realized the truth. The souls weren't just waiting for a savior. They were seeking something more. They wanted to be freed, but they also wanted to replace. They wanted Clara to take their place. Before she could react, an invisible force yanked her toward the roller coaster, to the solitary cart that awaited her. Despair overwhelmed her, but it was too late. The macabre sound of the cart approaching seemed to scratch at Clara's soul. The friction of the tracks against the metal echoed in her body, as if signaling that there was no turning back. When her hands touched the cold iron bar, the pressure around her chest intensified. The air became denser, as if the very environment was draining her energy. Her hands trembled as she tried to resist the invisible force pushing her toward the cart. She sat down, the cold metal of the seat almost piercing her skin, and the sensation of being watched grew even more intense. She looked around, but there was no one visible, only the shadows crawling around her. But she could feel something there, waiting to reveal itself. Suddenly, the roller coaster began to move, slowly, almost solemnly. The tracks creaked, as if protesting the weight of the fate being sealed there. The metallic clanging and snaps seemed amplified, echoing through the silent night like a harbinger of something terrible. Clara could feel the heat of the cursed attraction mixing with the cold that cut through her skin. She didn't know if she was moving forward or backward. The space around her felt distorted, the tracks twisting around her, the lights flickering erratically, as if time had stopped and she was trapped in an endless cycle. But then something began to change. The voices, those voices that had only been whispers, now became screams. Screams of pain, of anguish, of despair. They came from every direction, distorted and desperate, as if they were trying to communicate with her, or worse, warning her. But the truth was closer than she had imagined. The cart shot up with a force that made her stomach lurch. She tried to hold on, but the impact of each turn felt like it was tearing pieces of her soul away, and fear took over her body, paralyzing her. Everything around her was fragmenting into a distorted reality, a spiral of flashes and lights. But the voices were the only constants. There's no turning back. A voice whispered, but Clara didn't know from where. She looked around, her eyes straining to adjust to the growing darkness. The children were there, watching her, but they weren't the same as before. Their faces were distorted, their mouths open in a silent scream that seemed to pierce the air. They were trapped, not in their bodies, but in the very structures of the roller coaster, as if the attraction itself was their prison, a prison built to entrap the lost souls who had perished there. The cart climbed higher, the speed accelerating with every second, and Clara felt the pressure growing in her chest. Her eyes were fixed on one of the children, now only a few meters away, with empty eyes staring at her. The expression was hollow, lifeless, but Clara knew that the child's gaze was more than just emptiness. It was a condemnation, a warning. "You will take my place," the child whispered, its voice filled with infinite sorrow. Those words dragged through Clara's mind, and for a brief moment, she felt as if she had been ripped from her body, sinking into the depths of that vision. She saw the other souls, all piled together, all waiting, expecting something she couldn't fully understand. But the shadows around her began to form, contorting as if something was approaching, something inevitable. It was an overwhelming presence, a cosmic force that was there to take all the lost ones, but also to replace them. The cart suddenly plunged downwards, at a speed that took Clara's breath away. The wind sliced through her face, and she tasted a bitter sensation in her mouth, as if she were being dragged into an endless storm. She tried to close her eyes, but couldn't. She was seeing everything, every detail of the attraction, every shadow that moved, every face that stared at her. The cart went through a series of loops, making Clara lose control of her body. But deep down, she knew she wasn't just being taken by the roller coaster. She was being guided by something much darker. It was as if the cart was moving according to the will of the souls trapped there, following a twisted path that led nowhere. The feeling of hopelessness took over her as the visions of the victims grew more intense. The faces of the children were there, but now they weren't just watching. They were screaming, crying, begging. Shadows danced around Clara, their screams blending into a deafening chorus. They were pulling her toward a place she couldn't understand, a place where the line between life and death blurred, a place where death wasn't the end. And at the end of the ride, Clara realized something terrifying. The cycle had no end. She wasn't a spectator anymore, but a part of the attraction now. The roller coaster no longer had tracks ahead. All that was left was an abyss. The sound of the tracks faded away. Time froze. She was trapped there, forever. The silence was absolute. Clara felt the coldness take over her body. The wind was gone, the sound of the roller coaster too. All that remained was an impenetrable darkness, a dense void stretching in every direction. She didn't know where she was, or if she was still alive. The sounds of the screaming souls had dissipated, leaving only the echo of fear in her heart. Time wasn't passing, or maybe it had never existed. She looked around. There were no more tracks, no more carts. What remained was a crushing emptiness, where reality seemed to be falling apart before her eyes. The space around her was distorted, like a cracked screen, with each piece of the world slowly breaking apart. And then she saw something. A figure began to form in the darkness. Slowly, almost as if it were being pulled from the depths of the abyss, a silhouette appeared before her. The face was distorted, but Clara recognized the features. The children, the same children who had watched her throughout the journey. But now, they weren't looking at her anymore. They were staring at something behind her. Clara's breath stopped. Something was coming closer. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Her senses were on edge, the hairs on her body standing up with fear. She didn't want to turn around, but the impulse was stronger. Reluctantly, she turned slowly. The sight she encountered was the worst thing she could have imagined. The roller coaster was back, but now it was monstrous. The metal structures were twisted, as if shaped by an evil being, corrupting and distorting the very attraction. The lights were flickering in an erratic rhythm, but now they were red, as though they were bleeding. The sound of the metal screeching and the screams of the victims blended into a terrifying orchestra, echoing through the space around her. At the top of the roller coaster, Clara saw something even more horrifying. A massive figure, a dark shadow, without a defined shape. Just a presence that seemed to consume everything around it, an entity that wasn't human, but was so intertwined with the attraction that it became an extension of hell itself. The roller coaster, in its monstrous form, crawled toward her like an open mouth, ready to swallow her. And it was then that Clara understood. She hadn't just been a spectator of those lost souls. She was doomed to become one of them. The cycle was eternal. Every passenger who dared to enter the attraction wasn't just a victim, but a piece of the puzzle that fed the evil the ride carried. The children, the victims, the previous passengers, they were all there in an endless cycle, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to free them, but at the same time, trapping that soul in their place. The roller coaster wasn't just an attraction. It was a portal, a link between the world of the living and the dead, a prison that fed a demonic force with no beginning or end. Clara, now understanding the gravity of her situation, felt her body grow heavy, as if she were being pulled down. The dark presence drew closer to her, its eyes glowing with an infernal light. She tried to fight, but her legs were frozen, and her body seemed to be merging with the structure of the attraction. The screams of the children grew louder, now mixed with Clara's own screams. Terror consumed her mind, and she realized her journey had come to an end. But at the same time, she knew it wasn't the end of everything. Not for her. Not for anyone who ventured into that cursed place. She sat in the cart once more, as if being dragged toward the inevitable. The roller coaster began to move again, once more, without tracks, without a destination, but with one single purpose. Another soul to be swallowed, another cycle to be repeated. Clara no longer knew if she was alive or dead. She no longer knew anything. All she knew was that the roller coaster would never end. Hell was only beginning, and she was now part of it, forever.